Hi everyone, it's David Thompson with Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines, and I'm joined today by Dr. Barbara Gannon, who is an assistant professor of military history at the University of Central Florida and is the author of The One Cause, Black and White Comradeship in the Grand Army of the Republic, which is now out with the University of North Carolina Press. So Dr. Gannon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
If you don't mind, could you just give us a general overview of the book to get us started?
Well, I think one of the best ways to get an overview of the book is to sort of reverse the title.
Okay.
Black and White Comradeship in the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the largest Union veterans organization, is created by the One Cause. What it's basically about is it's initially about African American members of what people just generally say GAR, and their status in this organization, their involvement in it. It was the Union Army's largest veterans organization. Its membership peaked at 400,000. African Americans belonged to it, and it sort of began as a study of their involvement. But what I found out is black and white members of this organization had a very close relationship. They had a great deal of respect for each other, and it was a very unusual, particularly given the 19th century, relationship. So what I established is their comradeship together in this organization, and the last part of the book is about explaining that, and the way I do it is the one cause, which is what I think some Union veterans, particularly members of the GARs, remembered they had fought and sacrificed for during the Civil War.
And it's quite an interesting topic, and I think we'll get into talking a little bit more about the GAR here in a few minutes, but I was just curious, when you first, how did you come about with this project? How did you kind of decide on pursuing the GAR?
Well, it's actually very interesting. What happened was, like all graduate students, I was doing a seminar paper, and I said, I'm going to write about African Americans' views of Buffalo soldiers. So I went to the Library of Congress and I read all these black newspapers, and I was kind of frustrated and angry at the people of the past because they weren't talking about Buffalo soldiers. They seemed very interested, however, in the Grand Army of the Republic and Civil War veterans. So I decided, well, why don't you write a seminar paper on that? So I did. From that seminar paper came the book. But what was interesting is when I started, I assumed I would be talking about black veterans in this organization who were treated poorly or segregated by white members. And as time went on, I found out that was not true, and the book built from there.
And I wonder if you might be able to speak a little bit to the sources that you're using here. In your introduction, you lay out the fact that you're kind of coming at the GAR from a different angle than prior scholarship to some degree, and I was wondering if you might be able to comment on that.
Well, it started when I said I was going to work on this other project, and I started in African American newspapers, and that's where all the research began. I literally read every African American newspaper I could find that existed in like the 1880s, 90s, and just past the turn of the century. I was just looking for African Americans' perspectives on this group. And in the past, people have started from GAR records, particularly national records. So if you start there, particularly national records, you find all the controversies involving black membership. Since I started in black newspapers, I started with how African Americans felt, the organizations, all black organizations they created. I found the women's groups. It's a totally different story coming at it from the black perspective. The GAR, the white perspective, or the integrated perspective of this institution came later.
And I wonder, this idea, and obviously it's prominent enough to be in your title, comradeship. How does this notion, this idea, factor into a shared experience for black and white members of the GAR?
Well, I guess my first explanation for the fact that black and white members got along so well was kind of the obvious one, and I sort of thought it when I went in. Even when I thought African Americans weren't treated that well, I knew that they'd both been in the Union Army, and they probably remembered that, and that's why they were allowed to join. So I sort of accepted that. But comradeship was so much more complex than that, because I realized it was rooted in two things. One, the memory of what had happened in the war, which was very vivid to these men, because you don't forget terrible tragedies that happened to you. but also it was about the contemporary suffering. The Civil War didn't end for these men, either psychologically or physically. They were still ill from the war, sometimes wounds still bled. So there was this combination. Comradeship was both. So that's what made it very powerful. So comradeship was this idea that all veterans had, that even if they hadn't served at your side, anyone who wore the blue had suffered. So everyone, black, white, poor, rich, was gathered under this sort of rubric of comradeship.
I wonder, and it's probably something that comes up a lot when you discuss this book with individuals, Southern GAR posts. What was that interaction like?
Well, that was interesting. Everyone always begins, there was this attempt to segregate the Louisiana and Mississippi GAR into a black and a white department, i.e. Sort of administrative group. And what everyone forgets is that failed. It failed miserably. Now, there are places in the South blacks couldn't join, Alabama and Texas, but in most states in the South, African Americans were members. Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana and Mississippi, they come to dominate the GAR. In Tennessee, Arkansas, most places African Americans can join. Now, in most places, they're on their own posts, but there are some integrated posts in, for example, East Tennessee, which isn't surprising. But it is not as good a relationship in that there aren't as much integration within posts, but it's really surprisingly good given sort of the social customs that are surrounding the GAR that really preclude any kind of race mixing.
And certainly, when we're discussing the GAR, this extends beyond just the men who fought in the war. Women are playing an integral role in this process as well, in terms of the GAR affiliate posts, which you mentioned in the work. I wonder if you might be able to share just a little bit here with our viewers, kind of the role that women play in the one cause.
Well, what's interesting, when I set out this book, there's so many things I didn't think I'd be writing about. And women was certainly one of them. Being a woman, I personally had nothing against including them. But it was one of those things one of my friends, Gary Gallagher, says the sources drove me. What I found, particularly in the black newspapers, were women were very much a part of the post life. They were very important figures in so many ways. Now, I mostly concentrated on African American women in the ladies' auxiliaries of the Women's Relief Corps and the ladies of the Grand Army Republic. And there's been work on those, but usually it's as part of their larger white organizations. What I found is the most important thing is they were a very grassroots organization, and women felt a strong bond with their posts. I can't speak, I'm probably sure it was for white women, but African American women, it was a way for them to also participate in the battle for Civil War memory. They were involved in all their activities. They gave them material support and solace. And I was just astonished at how much women were involved in sort of the events in life of all black posts.
And now, obviously, you are an author, but you are a professor, so you are in the classroom quite a bit, and obviously the Civil War near and dear to your heart. When you step into that classroom to talk about the Civil War with your students, are there certain things that you try to impart upon them?
Well, I'd say the number one thing I try to impart is how absolutely tragic, horrific, catastrophic the Civil War was. I don't even think we have any way we can get our arms around it. It was terrible during the war. The legacy, the psychological, the physical handicaps, the men I write about who have diarrhea, chronic diarrhea decades after the war, we have no idea. I want them to understand how absolutely horrific it was. There's very little romance here. And that's, I think, one of the most important things I try to get them to understand.
I found it really striking in your introduction. You mentioned that when you're discussing casualties for the war, it's the equivalent of the amount of casualties on September 11th, day in and day out, for 4 years.
Yes, it is. If you break the math down and you compare to our population, it is. And it's not just being dead. Everyone focuses on being dead. You're alive. You live. There are people who live and they've been sick. I've read pension records where people have chronic diarrhea in 1895 from the war. I want you to think about that in a world There's no over-the-counter medicine. You live with that every day. You live with pain. Maybe if you're lucky, you drink yourself into a stupor. But the war, no one has even vaguely wrapped their mind around how terrible it was.
And do you think that's partially why this war still grabs us? Why we still have we have such a focus on it? Yeah.
Well, there's two things. I do believe that people do have a more romantic view of the war than they should be. But I also joked at a party once. I said Americans love the Civil War because Americans won every battle. And that is an attractive point. But I also do think there is something more important going on. The Civil War is a mirror in which we see ourselves. And what we're looking for changes through the decades. But there's some touchstone that keeps bringing us back to it. Whether it's race, now the size of the government, the role of the government, heroism, nationalism, people keep being pulled back to the mirror to see and explain themselves there in their nation. So that's why I think people are very attracted to the Civil War. It's attractive for many, many reasons, I believe.
Okay. Now, any book of recent note in your mind when it comes to Civil War publications, aside from your own, obviously, that has really stood out to you? Or do you have an old reliable that you always like to point to as just a great book that folks really should be paying attention to, if they haven't already?
Well, I sort of an old school, new school answer. Old school, I mean, I love Stillness and Appomattox by Bruce Canton. If you want to read an incredibly well-written book, you can't go wrong with that. Now, new school, I reviewed a book called Weirding the War. I love that book. It was so postmodern. It's so against what you read, which is, let's find a master narrative to fit the Civil War into. Let's clean it up so that the children can see it. It's very much the edges of the war. And I really like that a lot. From the master narrative point of view, I'm enjoying Alan Gelzel's Fateful Lightning, his new one volume. So I'm kind of all over the map, but, you know, when it comes to master narrative, Fateful Lightning, when I want to see those rather unpleasant edges, Weirding the War.
And it's certainly nice to have the ability to be seeing all those different elements out there in publication. So kind of depending on your mood, you can grab something that might pique your interest.
Yes.
Now, what are you working on presently? Obviously, being an academic, there's always some project that's being thought of, being worked on. So what's the next topic for you?
Well, I have two things. Prager asked me to do a book on Civil War memory, just sort of a one-volume synthesis. And I really, because I've thought a lot about it, and I want to bring up some points, particularly I teach oral history. What I've learned about the nature of memory, I think might straighten out some issues we have now. But actually, my bigger project is I'm doing a one-volume on veterans called Fought and Lived, American Veterans 1783 to 2013. What I'm going to do is try to make sense of the idea of veteran and explain why some veterans of some wars have been treated like victors and others like victims. Everyone thinks it was only Vietnam, but if you go back, American veterans have often had a very rough time after the war in receiving acceptance and the benefits they need. So that's the next big project.
Well, and certainly something that obviously encompasses the war, but is pulling in either direction as well, before and after. So should be quite something when it does come out. Well, Dr. Gannon, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing with us a little bit about the book. Again, it's The One Cause, Black and White Comradeship in the Grand Army of the Republic. I neglected to mention at the beginning of the interview that just this past weekend you were awarded the Wiley Silver Prize down at Ole Miss for Best First Book on the Civil War. So I wanted to extend a congratulations to you for that honor, and I would highly recommend this work to those that are interested in the war, interested in GAR, memory. It kind of brings all those ideas together and definitely provides a different take, I think, for a lot of people, particularly when it comes to Civil War memory. And I think people will be pleasantly surprised. So, Dr. Gannon, again, thank you so much, and hope to have you on again soon.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it very much.